Okay, let's look at the age of nationalism by looking at three countries in particular and some of the changes that go on in these countries. And some of the main events that cause these countries to undergo a transformation during the age of nationalism. The first one we're going to look at is England. One of the things going on with England during this time period is that you can see I have a Reform Bill of 1867, a Reform Bill of 1884. That refers to voting rights, to suffrage rights. One of the things that's happening in England is the House of Commons is asserting greater and greater authority to govern England or to govern Britain as well. So the House of Commons is the deliberative body that sort of passes laws for England and manages. Out of the House of Commons, the party with the most seats in the House of Commons gets to choose the Prime Minister of England. So it's the Prime Minister who is the figure, the leader of the party that has the most seats in the House of Commons. And when I say parties, you have basically two main parties in the early and in the 19th century, essentially. Two main parties, Conservative Party and a Liberal Party. Both parties are interested in some reforms. You'll see government becoming more responsive to the needs of people, supporting cleaning up cities, improving education, the bank holiday, as we talked about. That is, government's becoming more responsive to demands from the people for change. Why? What happens if you give people voting rights, they may vote for parties that give them what they want. That tends to happen. So England is going to embark on a period of decades where it becomes more and more democratic. And that means voting rights for men, not women. And the reform bills basically refer to voting rights. In 1867, you have a conservative prime minister by the name of Benjamin Disraeli. He gives the right to vote to more and more workers, thinking that the workers are going to support the Conservative Party. And that's not actually what happens. But the reform bill does expand the electorate. Another reform bill comes along in 1884 when you have William Gladstone, who is the leader of the Liberal Party, a liberal prime minister. He enacts the Reform Bill of 1884, which essentially gives the right to vote to most men in England. You have to own some property or at least show that you have employment or something like that. But most people, most men, I should say, not most people, most men in England have the right to vote after that 1884 Reform Bill. And so what has to happen is leaders have to appeal to the electorate to win elections. So you have to at least support the demands that people want. You have to at least pay attention to the concerns of the electorate so that you can get elected. And what's going on at that time is the working class feels that they are being neglected by both parties. Socialism is pretty prominent among the working class, not the socialism that calls for violent revolution, but the socialism that calls for maybe health insurance, accident benefits, old age pensions, reduced working hours, those sorts of things. That is, changes to the labor market at that time. They want higher wages and more time off. That's basically what they want. They want a safer place to work in. So what you see is the rise of a socialist party called the Labor Party. It is a party designed to represent the needs of urban workers. Now, it's a moderate socialist party. It is a revisionist socialist party or an evolutionary socialist party. What the Labor Party is that we want our labor unions supported. We want more time off. We want more holidays. We want higher wages. Those are the things. They're not calling for revolution. So in a sense, you saw these early socialists that we talked about, French utopian socialists and Marxists, who said you had to have this massive transformation of society because early industrialization impoverished most people. Well, by the late 19th century, the impoverishment has declined. More and more people, while they're not getting super wealthy or anything, they're getting richer. They're getting a little better off. Wages are going up. They're able to buy more stuff. They're able to eat better. So this whole notion that capitalism was going to collapse didn't happen. And it hasn't happened since, of course. So this is why it's evolutionary or revisionary. That is, it's different. We like some of the socialist ideas without the revolution, that sort of thing. So you peacefully transform society into a more socialist society, a society that creates a number of government programs that they support. So it's peaceful transformation. That is, one of the things you can have a Labor Party is since men get the right to vote, they can vote for socialist candidates. They can vote for candidates that say support a minimum wage or something like that. That's what they mean. So, and governments are going to have to respond to that. And one way they respond to that is when liberals pass something known as the people's budget, maybe to help the working class, to reduce the popularity of the Labor Party. They pass the people's budget. David Lloyd George is the chancellor of the exchequer at that time. He's in charge of the budget at that time. And the people's budget is basically a tax on the rich, a tax on land, some sin taxes, that is, a tax on things like liquor to sort of reduce the likelihood of people spending an excessive amount of money on liquor. So those are called sin taxes. But you tax the rich, you tax the land. They don't really want to do that. They don't particularly care to be taxed. Who wants to pay more in taxes? Not many people want to pay more in taxes. So the rich working through the House of Lords. The House of Lords is a hereditary part of Parliament. This is where the lords, the aristocrats, sit. It's sort of their version of our Senate, except our Senate is elected. Although at that time, senators were chosen by the states rather than being elected by the people like they are today. So the House of Lords, they're not elected. They serve for life. They're hereditary peers. They're the old aristocrats. They don't want to pay more in taxes. They don't want their land taxed. So they reject this. So one of the things that happens is the Liberal Party introduces something known as the Parliament Bill, a Parliament Bill that says if a budget bill passes the House of Commons 3 consecutive years, it becomes law. That is, the House of Lords cannot reject it more than 2 times. Now, why? The House of Lords has to actually pass the Parliament Bill for it to become law. And this is where the King of England steps in. The King of England steps in and says, you better pass this Parliament Bill or I will expand the House of Lords. I will create new lords to sit in the House of Lords. He could double, triple, quadruple the size of the House of Lords. The king has that power. He can pick a bunch of electricians or whoever he wants. Not that there are electricians around at that time. He can pick anybody he wants. He can pick all sorts of members of the lower classes to sit in the House of Lords. And you have to remember, the House of Lords is a very elite society. It's like an elite country club. It's very limited in terms of its membership. And these members of the House of Lords don't want anyone to become a member of the House of Lords. And that's what the king is threatening. He's threatening the exclusivity of the House of Lords. It's like people who live maybe in a super wealthy gated community. Guess what? We're going to build government housing here and put in. They don't want that. So they pass the Parliament Bill. So they get to only stop the people's budget for 2 years in a row, and that's why it's going to become law. It's going to become policy for England because the House of Lords has to agree to it. They also agree to something known as the National Insurance Act. That's part of the people's budgetary process that gives health insurance to the English that has to be paid for. And if you look at European societies today, most European countries today, because they started a bit earlier than we have, they have sort of national health insurance throughout Europe. It's still kind of a controversial thing today. Some of the other things going on in England, the suffragette movement, there's a voting rights movement. Why just give the right to vote to men and not to women? Women are educated. You mean to tell me that educated women can't vote, but uneducated men, because they're adults, can vote? So you see a movement among women for voting rights. There's a moderate movement at first trying to convince members of parliament through reasoned appeals to give women the right to vote. That doesn't get far. So you see a new group, a more violent group led by Emmeline Pankhurst and her daughters Sylvia and Christabel. They're called the suffragettes. It's a violent movement. It's a radical movement. They do commit acts of violence. They get arrested. They go on hunger strikes in jail. It is a violent movement. And the violence actually turns people off to women's voting rights. Peaceful movements tend to work better, but they don't work as quickly as some other movements, but they do get attention. This is a time period when at the Epsom Derby, you have a martyr for the cause who jumps in front of the king's horse and dies with a shirt, votes for women. Also at this time, there's another violent movement going on in England. It's Home Rule. That is, Home Rule refers to independence for Ireland. The English conquered Ireland centuries ago. Ireland is a conquered country. Most of the Irish are Catholic, but over the centuries, a number of Protestants have moved into Ireland, particularly Northern Ireland. So what you have essentially is a Northern Ireland and a Southern Ireland that we call Irish. So Northern Ireland, inhabited by Protestants, they consider themselves British. They want to remain loyal to Britain. And the southern part are the Irish Catholics, Irish Catholics. And they want independence. Many of them want independence. They want their own country. And they want their own country to include that northern part because Catholics outnumber Protestants in Ireland. And what happens is there's a threat of civil war going on as both sides organize militia. They take up arms. There's about to be civil war over this issue of home rule. A home rule bill passes the House of Commons in 1914. It's rejected. It's rejected again in 1913. But remember, the Parliament bill says if it's brought up 3 times, it gets to pass, and it passes in 1914. It's going to be put on hold. 1914 is the year World War I breaks out. There are all kinds of issues about imposing home rule on Ireland. What's the process going to involve? How will the military get involved in this? And then within the military, there are a number of commanders in the British military who say they won't impose home rule. That is, they're willing to disobey a government order. They're willing to commit treason. So it's a serious, serious issue that's going to be put off because of World War II. There are also some other things going on in England at that time. There's a wave of strikes and violent strikes as well that occurs within England just towards the outbreak of World War I. And a number of people looking at England, what's going on in our society? Our society is fracturing. We have too many threats of civil war and violence. What's going on? Well, those are going to be put on the back burner as England's going to confront World War I. France is a bit different. France is a country that lost to the Germans. It had Napoleon III as emperor. He's overthrown. He leaves. He flees. France becomes a republic, and France is really divided. It's a divided country. There are a lot of people who like having a strong leader, an emperor, a military leader, maybe a king. People want a return of the monarchy. And there are those who want greater and greater democracy. A republic is a democracy. It's a form of democracy. We vote for people to lead, like in America, and to the republic for which it stands. We're a republic. We vote for people to hold office. So there are those in France who want democracy, and there are those in France who are opposed to democracy. France gets a democracy after losing the Franco-Prussian War. There are a number of government scandals. There's all kinds of corruption going on, some involving the Panama Canal. There's scandals in the military. One of the big scandals going on involves sort of a degree of anti-Semitism within France. There's a guy by the name of Dreyfus, a captain in the French military, who is accused of treason. Somebody is selling secrets to the Germans. It's figured out by French military intelligence that somebody's selling secrets. And they nail this guy, Dreyfus. He has access to this information, and he's Jewish. It turns out the evidence actually leads to somebody else. There was another guy who was a womanizer and a bit of a boozer. He had an incentive to sort of commit treason because he was always in debt. But this Dreyfus guy is an easy target. He's an easy target because he's Jewish. And people begin to say, yeah, that's exactly what Jews do. They're not real Frenchmen. They are traitors. You better be suspicious. And at this time, there's a lot of opposition to Jews, hatred of Jews. And it's something that has been around for a long time. Religious anti-Semitism goes back to the foundation of Christianity, where it was believed, at least some Christians said, the Jews killed Jesus, they rejected Jesus. There's economic anti-Semitism, hatred of Jews, because Jews happen to be, at least a large number of Jews, not all, there are poor Jews. Jews happen to be successful economically. It was Jews who started some of the department stores and Jews were prominent in the medical profession, prominent as lawyers, so prominent in business. And then there's this idea of racial anti-Semitism, that the Jews are a race. They're a unique group, just like other groups in society. They are a unique group. They're a race, and they're different from others. And the idea that you can't change your race. So even if you're Jewish and you become Catholic, for instance, no, you're still Jewish, according to racial anti-Semitism. So there are a variety of ways that the French and others hate Jews. And what you begin to see on this issue of conviction of Dreyfus is information that shows that this guy was not treated fairly. This was a fraudulent trial that convicted him of treason. It's somebody else, and they're covering up. But you see French society dividing over this. We have Look at America. America's divided politically. And you see you have certain groups, monarchists, the military, the Catholic Church, conservatives in France. They support the conviction of Dreyfus. And then those who support his innocence, or the left, the socialists, Republicans. And when I mean Republicans, I mean people who support democracy, and a number of intellectuals. And you have all sorts of problems. I mean, families are split, people fight over this stuff. But France is a democracy. And it just so happens one of the things that occurs is those parties of democracy win in French elections. And they're going to make some changes. One of the things that they're going to do is exonerate Dreyfus. He's exonerated from treason, gets his commission back and all of that other stuff. Another thing they do is separate church and state. The Catholic Church is no longer a state institution. And so this government, it becomes pretty anti-Catholic at times, and it has to increase the size of the public school system because it's no longer going to support Catholic schools. So you have a separation of church and state. The Pope breaks off relations with France. And another thing, because the army, mistreated this guy, they're going to have greater civilian control over the army. And that's what happens. New systems of promotions, new systems of control over various aspects of the military. And they get a number of commanders in the military to retire. Now we're headed to World War I. Some of these commanders were actually quite good, but for their political beliefs, they're going to be brushed aside. And you're going to have a new commitment to democracy and separation of church and state. You have to have the right to political beliefs to rise in rank in the French military. And one of the things that happens is the Democrats, those who support democracy, don't think about Democrat and Republican Party in America. They win in France, and those on the right become a sort of minority in France. Now let's look at this big old chunk of change, Russia over here. Russia is the most backwards of these countries. It's a great power, but it's among the weakest of the great powers. Remember, we had the Crimean War that it lost. Got a new emperor at that time, a guy by the name of Alexander II, who believed that the backwardsness of Russia was one of the reasons why it lost. And it had a backwards economic system, and that was serfdom. So he freed some 22 million serfs. That's also around the same time as the Civil War. He did it in 1861. Remember, the Civil War in America frees the slaves. He organizes the freed serfs into village communes called mirs. It doesn't actually go so well for some of the serfs. It's not like they get a lot of land that's valuable farmland, but they're no longer sort of essentially in serfdom or enslaved. 1894, this guy Nicholas II comes along. He's the last czar, the last emperor of Russia, Nicholas II. He believes he's a divine right emperor. He's not terribly powerful, kind of weak-willed, has a wife, Alexandra, and a son, Alexei, who suffers from hemophilia. There is a perverted monk who supposedly through hypnosis helps control his hemophilia. Hemophilia, by the way, you get a paper cut. It refers to the fact that you don't have your blood cannot clot. So it could lead to bleeding to death, and it's incredibly, incredibly painful. Meanwhile, it's not like people in Russia don't know what's going on in the rest of the world. They see the rest of the world is industrializing. They see the rest of the world is moving to democracy, and they embrace some other ideas as well. So you have calls for democratic changes within Russia, and you have calls for socialism in Russia. So you have a variety of different opposition groups. And it's a period of turmoil. You have assassinations of political leaders throughout Russia. But one group in particular is kind of interesting as an opposition group. This is the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party. That's a big, long name. I think in America, it's easy to have Democrat and Republican. European parties, or even in Britain, conservative, liberal, labor. Some of these parties in the rest of Europe have long names. So we just reduce this socialist and Marxist party to the Social Democratic Party, Social Democratic Party. There are actually two factions of the Social Democratic Party, Mensheviks and Bolsheviks. These are Marxists. Marx laid out a theory of how to have a communist revolution. You follow these steps, essentially. And the Mensheviks are part of the faction that says we need to follow the steps. According to Marx, a country has to industrialize and has to have a large urban working class, a lot of workers, so you can actually have a workers' revolution that overthrows the government. That's what the Mensheviks believe, because that's what Marx said. The Bolsheviks are different. They're led by Lenin and a few others, but Vladimir Lenin is the prominent figure. He says, no, we don't have to wait for Russia to industrialize. Russia's not fully industrialized just yet. Instead, if you have a dedicated group of Marxists who are really dedicated, a small group, they could lead the revolution. He believes that. So you can skip some steps in the Marxist theory to achieve communism. So they're split. And then what happens? Russia gets involved in a war with Japan, and it does not go well with Russia. They lose this Russo-Japanese war, and revolution breaks out in Russia. There are protests, there are strikes. Price of food just skyrockets. Russia can't even support the military and feed its people at this time. During one demonstration called Bloody Sunday, troops from the Tsar shoot some of these peaceful protesters to try to disperse them. So hundreds die in this. Doesn't stop the protests. They continue. And finally, it forces the Tsar to do something. And in October, he issues the October Manifesto, in which he says, I'm going to change the government. But is this going to be a revolution? Russia will no longer be an absolute monarchy. With a divine right monarch, Russia is going to become a constitutional monarchy, a king with a constitution that limits its power, and a legislature based on universal manhood suffrage called the Duma. That's the Russian legislature. It's the Duma. So people are going to get the right to vote. They're going to get a constitution with basic civil liberties, calling for freedom of speech and all that stuff. And the king is no longer going to be an absolute king, but a limited monarchy, limited by the Constitution and the legislature. That's the October Manifesto. That's actually a revolution. It changes the government, but it doesn't change it completely. It's a partial revolution because within a couple of years, the electoral laws are rewritten. So only a few people can vote, and the elites in society can vote. So when you think of the elites, they tend to think the way the Tsar does. So it's not a drastic change that happens in Russia. Sure, I mean, if you restrict voting rights to only a few people, and particularly the few people who tend to be on the conservative pro-Tsar side of the electorate, then that's going to not really change the government dramatically. But it's a start. And Russia's going to go into 1914 without really modernizing, thinking it's ready for war, thinking all sorts of wrong things. Nicholas is not going to be the right person to lead Russia in World War II. He's going to make a lot of mistakes, and it's not going to go well for Russia. By the way, during 1905, we saw the appearance in cities like Moscow and St. Petersburg, another major city. We saw the appearances of these things called Soviets. A Soviet is just a council, but these are organized by the communists. Soviets, a council. Later on in World War I, we'll see the reappearance of Soviets with these Marxist councils that'll ultimately lead to a revolution that overthrows the Tsar and gets Russia out of this war, World War I, and we'll stop there.